So, we did our starter. The big themes we have for today were NIMBYism, steering, and white flight. So a little preview of that. So, chapter 10 starts off with talking about zoning codes. And I know there's been discussion of zoning codes here in Denver a lot. Here, they really focus in on single family zoning, saying that even though that approach to zoning may not seem discriminatory on its face, right? Saying you can only have one home in this lot. In fact, it produces a discriminatory result, and they cover some of the history of seeing connections between the move to push for single family housing and single family zoning as connected to more racially explicit zoning practices. The mechanism that you end up with this discriminatory result is that single family housing limits housing supply and that increases cost. So that disproportionately excludes African Americans who are subject to the wealth gap that has been discussed in prior portions of the book. And also this single family housing restricting essentially the housing supply ends up perpetuating the impact of more explicit policies like redlining and restrictive covenants that kept African Americans out of communities when they were being built and when they were more affordable. You then end up with this dynamic where higher property values, as you know, this limited supply has its price go up, good macroeconomic way, ends up with an increased tax base. You have a higher income population that needs fewer services per capita. And then you have this tax base that feeds into having more amenities like schools, parks, things like that. Those amenities make a neighborhood or community more expensive, more desirable, which means that it becomes more exclusive, and you end up with a dynamic where folks who are used to those amenities end up holding them more tightly and are resistant to sharing them. So the authors encourage moving away from single family housing, but they note that even when there are laws, like whole statewide laws, municipality level laws that prohibit single family or limit single family housing zoning, it doesn't happen very much. You don't get much densification, primarily because of NIMBYism, the not in my backyard dynamic. Often they say folks object on the basis of changing the character of single family zoned predominantly white communities. Increase Folks say that it'll increase the need for services like police. It'll decrease property values. Maybe there are environmental concerns that get brought up. And things like overwhelming schools or decreasing the quality of them. And the authors point out that usually these kinds of objections are unfounded or overblown, like the increased need for services or decreased property values, and really mostly reflect sort of racist or classist assumptions. So they say you got to push through NIMBYism, do some zoning code reform, and I liked their framing that it is necessary because you need to have a greater variety and more housing available to have the inclusionary zoning across multiple price points that they've talked about, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. You need those inclusionary zoning approaches that they talked about in the prior section, making sure that you're doing things like using the low-income housing tax credit in higher income and gentrifying communities, that you're making housing available and subsidies available for that missing middle of middle class and working class folks. They then go on to, as they're talking about subsidies, talk about the Housing Choice Voucher Program, HCVP, which is often better known as Section 8. It's a federal program that provides subsidies to lower income folks that makes it so that they only pay 30% of their income for rent. So if your income is $0, then you're going to pay 30% of $0 for your rent. If your income is $1,000, you're going to pay $300 for your rent. And it's available, or folks are eligible, if you make up to 80% of an area median income. But the federal government that gives these funds to local housing authorities tends to, or maybe explicitly, requires that the vouchers go first to very low income folks. And so it doesn't end up actually getting used by folks more in that middle chunk of income. That contributes to a sense that the vouchers are just for the very poor. There's also a sort of structural piece built in where for most housing authorities in most areas, the voucher amounts, like the maximum amounts, are limited to less than the area median rent. And so essentially it prohibits folks receiving these vouchers from going to moderate or higher income areas, ending up sort of making Section 8 just a program for poor areas and poor people. Instead of providing the choice that they are designed to provide and the opportunity for mobility to higher opportunity areas, very few people actually move into higher opportunity areas. Another dynamic that limits the effectiveness of Section 8 is that landlords don't accept the vouchers, and in most places they are allowed to discriminate on the basis of Section 8 vouchers. Finally, they emphasize, got a friend visiting me here. This is a giraffe. Another dynamic that gets in the way of Section 8 being more useful for folks is that there are strict time limits on how quickly you have to find a place that will accept your voucher. It's 60 days. And so if you're having trouble finding a place in a desirable area with a landlord that'll accept it, then often folks just take kind of what they can get so that they don't lose something they've been on a wait list for years. So they propose that actually Section 8 could be used as a tool for wealth building. Steps include for local governments and states pass Section 8 non-discrimination laws. They found that this is helpful and it's important to partner with nearby areas. So if your county says you can't discriminate on this basis, but an adjacent county says you can, then the impact is more limited. Increasing time to find an apartment, increasing the maximum amount of the subsidy, partnering with fair housing centers to sort of fill in some of the gaps, like providing security deposit assistance or counseling on how to navigate the system, like what your rights are as you push back and maybe, try to challenge discrimination you're facing. There's also opportunity to proactively recruit landlords, provide them education around like, oh no, like actually people who receive Section 8 vouchers are not more likely to cause damage. They aren't more likely to miss payments. Even in some ways, Section 8 is a more dependable revenue stream because even if a tenant misses their payment, they're just paying a small portion of the rent. The government's still going to give you your portion. And they brought up examples where housing authorities have developed funds to compensate landlords for missed rent or excessive damages. And those are rarely used because, again, Section 8 using families and people are not necessarily more likely to cause damage. Finally, just being a YIMBY, a yes in my backyard for Section 8 acceptance, especially if you are living in a more affluent community like Central Park here. So, Chapter 11. This is the part we were talking about before we officially started. Um, so they go through some of the history of developers, banks, and even things like newspapers contributing to residential segregation. So developers made explicitly segregated neighborhoods. And though they are not now explicitly segregated, often African Americans who have missed out on the opportunity to build wealth or to build ties to that community don't necessarily have access to those. Um, they emphasize that a lot of the companies that were bad actors in the past uh, still exist in some form, often having been folded into big organizations and companies that we all recognize, like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Coldwell Banker, Kodak, and that these organizations, although they may have philanthropic goals, they may have DEI efforts, things like that. They essentially, in no cases that they bring up in the book, have done actual work to explicitly redress the harm done by those practices in the past. And then pull, uh, they point out the role that newspapers have had in supporting the real estate industry and vice versa, real estate supporting newspapers through ads and classifieds over the years, and that often those ads have included explicit racial prohibitions and contingencies. So both real estate ads and then also job ads, which then ties into limiting ability of Black folks to access the kind of employment and wealth that they might otherwise have. Realtors, realtors, man. So the authors here go through some of the history of realtors being leaders in actually pushing lenders, developers, politicians on making racial segregation or residential segregation a thing. Starting with codes of ethics that explicitly required racial segregation, kind of dancing around issues as the courts and government tried to address those issues, like saying, instead of, now our code of ethics says you can't sell to someone where that would reduce property. I don't know why I said property sales, property values, which is kind of code for this white type. Messed me up on this slide. Uh, code for selling to Black folks. Um, yeah, the licensing boards at the state level were complicit in this, of pulling licenses of realtors who didn't reinforce segregation, trying to get laws passed and pushing against laws that, so laws passed enshrining the right to discriminate in housing sales, trying to prevent laws being passed prohibiting discrimination, and finding ways around it, like saying that they worked in a loophole of, if something was sold by owner, then you are allowed to discriminate. And then kind of like with the like gun show loophole, finding ways around by redefining what was happening. Um, and even into the 70s, trying to keep folks from testing for discrimination. Then talk about realtors now. Big things going on include steering, so showing different homes to white and Black purchasers, having different requirements, like having mortgage pre-approval for Black folks, but not white folks. Yeah, just really shifting how you present what is available, how affordable it is, and how desirable a neighborhood is. Um, Paired testing, where you have a white potential purchaser with the same like uh, CV, the same resume or application eligibility for a particular mortgage or expressed interest in things, and a Black tester. They go and see who gets shown what, and yeah, found that discrimination tends to occur often, a third to like a half of realtors being tested. But testing doesn't happen often because it is often left to local fair housing centers, and it's expensive to train up actors or volunteers and have the equipment to push for it. So realtors not doing their best, and that's all reflective of current things. So they also talk about after all of the process of, all right, I found a home, now I have to get insurance. African Americans run into discrimination here as well, where agents charge African American applicants substantially more on their premiums, offer less additional coverage, offer fewer discounts. Um, they just don't return calls for folks with African American names. And that there's even a dynamic, this was back in 1992 when a lot of this was sort of brought to light, where insurance companies would have a minimum insured value. And because Black families were more likely to be in lower valued homes because of all these historical factors, that excluded many Black home buyers. So, what to do about these dynamics? Um, First is just funding fair housing centers for broad, regular testing, and in a way of trying to redress some of the past harms or take responsibility for the dynamics that are still showing up. They say real estate, banking, and insurance firms should be the ones contributing to this funding. Um, as community members, if folks want to volunteer to be actors, to do this testing, that's something they recommend or say, yeah, reach out to your fair housing center, offer to help. Um, and as you're finding either discrimination or not, there's also an opportunity for community groups to provide preferential advertisement or recommendations when you find good actors, and to pressure state licensing boards to actually discipline specific individuals rather than sort of have things hidden in aggregate data. Another piece that they brought up for community members is that you can sit in on continuing education courses that realtors are required to take and say, all right, did this feel like this course on non-discrimination actually had substance or not? And a final piece is educating that the Fair Housing Act actually encourages efforts to integrate neighborhoods. Uh, they note that the National Realtors Association tells members the opposite. And so there's work to be done to, yeah, try to undo the sense of like we need to be colorblind, or that there are legal consequences of advocating for desegregation. The next chapter is about active desegregation efforts. First, as a bit of definitional things, white flight is a term often used when white residents flee, when they increasingly leave a neighborhood as it starts to desegregate. Often that's just sort of prompted by the fear of desegregation. Like a Black family moves in, and then many white families feel like, ah, there goes the neighborhood. Back middle of the last century, when this was happening a lot more. This was facilitated by blockbusting, where real estate agents or agents of them would use scare tactics to make white residents feel like they needed to leave, either out of fear of crime or decreasing property values, which would lead to white residents accepting lower prices for their homes. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of kind of a run on the bank sort of situation, where property values do decline, then those agents scoop up homes at cheap values and sell them back to new Black residents at inflated values. So, this is a dense slide. Uh, the authors give some examples of active desegregation in communities around the country: Westmount Airy, Oak Park, and Cleveland Heights. It's more Midwesty. Um, Examples they gave, these are, often starting in the 60s, 70s, were communities deciding that it was important to them, something they valued, to have an integrated community. So neighborhood groups did a lot of direct outreach, living room conversations, open houses, potlucks, connecting with faith communities, just plain old advertisement to African American communities to move in. And many of those living room conversations and direct outreach were to white families to say, like, hey, like, don't flee. The things that you're hearing are not accurate. Yeah, just hang out. Things are fine. Letters to the editor to change the vibe and culture, but then also community coordination. So reaching out to banks to try to get equal terms for Black and white buyers, reaching out to real estate companies to get a code of ethics and expectation that all the available homes in that community would be shown to both Black and white buyers. Trying to work against the run on the bank dynamic. So taking out or saying don't put up for sale and sold signs, so that there wasn't a sense of like, oh, there's a for sale sign every other house down the block. Everyone's leaving. I should leave. Um, and in more modern times, working to connect folks to fair housing centers, providing rental reimbursement for landlords to say, like, hey, if you work with the Fair Housing Center here, if your apartment is empty for an extended period while you're waiting for someone to be referred through, we'll compensate you for that. And even directly referring applicants to apartment buildings to help desegregate them. Let's see. There are things you can do to develop just a sense of community: food co-ops, art centers. Some communities even put together a nonprofit real estate association back when existing real estate associations would, or real estate agencies would not sell to Black homeowners, and a home equity insurance program. So saying, all right, everyone pays in and you can sign up and we'll cover, I feel like they said it was like 80% of the decline in your property value if you end up leaving, um, as a way of just alleviating people's concerns about declines in property value. And then when they developed this, it was never actually used. So it sort of shows like, yeah, all of this is made up. It's just scaring folks. They did paired testing of real estate agents, as we have discussed. They banned steering, blockbusting, and unwanted solicitation, um, developed fair housing ordinances, and I'm forgetting which community it was of the three they talked about, but one just sued real estate companies. It was white residents suing the real estate companies for preventing them from living in an integrated community. So those are all options. People have done them. From the Cleveland Heights folks, I just wanted to highlight, I thought this was a useful thing to bring up. They put together a worksheet of like common concerns that white families would have about a more integrated neighborhood. What will the neighbors think? Will property values go down? I don't want to rock the boat. Isn't it true that whites won't buy after Black people move in? Isn't it true that Black people don't keep up their property? Isn't it better for people to live with their own kind? And so as they heard these concerns, they developed common answers that they could give to folks and facilitate different understanding of what was going on. And I had the thought, like, like, I wonder nowadays, this is more for discussion later, but like, where do we see those same kind of concerns coming up about, oh, if this kind of person lived in our neighborhood? What will people think? I don't want to rock the boat. Won't property values go down? They don't want to keep up their property. So put a pin in that. Uh, the authors then move on to talking about the close linkage between residential and school segregation. Say, school segregation makes neighborhood integration difficult, if not impossible, and neighborhood segregation makes school segregation inevitable. So that makes sense. People like to go to school close to where they are, and schools are often funded by property taxes, as discussed before. When you have a differential property tax rate, then schools get different amounts of funding, and then pretty soon you have good schools and not so good schools. Yeah, so there is the money and funding and resources side of things. Another piece in the post or during No Child Left Behind era is that there is increasing emphasis on an awareness of school test results and these sort of quantitative measures of school quality. But mostly those metrics just are a proxy for race and wealth. So much so that the National Realtors Association, which is not always the best, explicitly tells realtors like, hey, like, don't talk about these, even though people still do, because they reinforce and perpetuate residential segregation. I pulled a few stats just as an example for our community here of seeing some of that correlation showing up. Notably, school rating websites like Great Schools include direct links for purchasing a home. And so folks will talk about like, I want to live in a good school district. Essentially, that's ending up intentionally or not being code for I want to live in an affluent white school district. They touch as well on the school to prison pipeline, which is a dynamic where even in, as toddlers in preschool, African-American children are punished more often and more harshly, including suspensions and expulsions, including expulsions from childcare. That sets up where you have a dynamic of like, oh, you have this ongoing sense of I don't belong here, people don't want me here. Yeah, and there are more problems, less school engagement. The percentage of African American students in a school predicts the severity of school measure or security measures at a school. And then you end up with sort of this is like communities, neighborhoods being over policed or stop and frisk kinds of things, where the mere presence of having police there increases the likelihood that kids are going to become justice involved. And conduct that would ordinarily be handled by educators, counselors, is instead handled by police, and they are hammers looking for nails. That contributes to higher stress for Black students. Then you end up with a greater likelihood of dropping out, not attending college, and having arrests and incarcerations as adults. An important stat that the authors put in here is that in the face of increasing security measures at schools and increased police presence, only 3% of children murdered each year are killed at school. There is a lot of media attention on school shootings, and that number has not necessarily changed, even as people are increasing the number of police or having an increased sense that schools are dangerous. So, how do you desegregate schools? Ideas they introduce include revising school boundaries to support a more diverse student body, allowing students to cross school boundaries more flexibly, and to make sure that leaving one school doesn't end up with the school you're departing getting underfunded. So making sure you are funding both schools, both the leaving and the receiving schools. And they gave the example of a school district or a city in Connecticut that does that. Keeping in mind that there are some examples they gave where building new schools can actually serve as a means to prevent Black students from going to white schools and vice versa. Um, and that there are opportunities to increase Black students' access to white schools, activities, resources like summer school, after school programs, things like that. Even providing education to communities on the value of integrated schools can be helpful, emphasizing that separate from the test scores that then lead people to choose segregated schools. Uh, in fact, students going to integrated schools have better educational, employment, and social outcomes. Um, they gave the examples of realtors in California who have paired with or partnered with local communities to give the realtors an opportunity to be in the schools and get a sense of what does it actually look like, rather than relying on these numbers that aren't helpful in understanding the actual quality of education. And to address the school to prison pipeline dynamic, they encourage reforming discipline and safety processes. So rather than putting money into police, put them into psychosocial supports like therapists, counselors, social workers, ending zero tolerance policies, adopt a broad restorative justice program, and to only include law enforcement for serious behavioral issues. Another thought they had, yeah, was to say, oh, like, in fact, yes, there is formal funding from the government, and many schools get a lot of their funding or supplementary funding from parents and donors. Those donors could say, we want some of our donation to be shared with under-resourced schools. So the epilogue is 2 pages. It is super brief, even though in the physical copy of the book, it looks like you're only halfway through the whole thing. I was geared up for a long bit of reading. The short version is you don't have to do everything yourself. They give a whole bunch of ideas throughout the book, and they encourage just kind of taking the new knowledge, try an idea that's exciting for you as a person and feels like a fit, for, am I a more introverted or extroverted person? Where am I connected? Where do I sit within my community? Um, and to go with what works for you. Essentially just do something, rather than do nothing. And that is it. We're done with the book. We did it.
Thanks. All right, shall I turn off the recording?
Yeah.
All right.